Apple has conquered design, software, and supply chains, becoming the most valuable company on Earth. But there is one battle they have consistently lost for over a decade. Beneath the titanium chassis of your iPhone lies a hidden war that Apple cannot engineer its way out of. When you hold an iPhone in your hand, you are looking at a miracle of modern engineering, supply chain logistics, and brand equity. But beneath the glass and the titanium chassis lies a hidden economic reality that Apple desperately wants to keep invisible. You assume that when you pay $1,000 for a device, you are paying for the hardware and the software. You are wrong. A significant portion of that transaction is immediately diverted to a shadow consortium of telecommunications giants, companies like Qualcomm, Ericsson, and Nokia. This is not a tax levied by any government. It is a royalty extraction regime enforced by the global elite of cellular infrastructure. To understand this power dynamic, we must first deconstruct the concept of standard essential patents, or SEPs. Unlike a standard patent, where a competitor can simply design around an invention, creating a different way to unlock a screen or process an image, SEPs are unavoidable. They are the fundamental axioms of cellular communication. To connect to a 3G, 4G, or 5G network, a device must utilize these specific, patented methodologies. There is no alternative engineering path. This creates a scenario of technological determinism. If you want to build a smartphone that connects to the internet, you do not have a choice in the matter. You must pay the toll. The mechanism of this control begins in the quiet meeting rooms of organizations like ETSI, the European Telecommunications Standards Institute, or 3GPP. Here, engineers from the world's leading telecom firms gather to define the next generation of global standards. While this appears to be a collaborative effort for human progress, in reality, it is a strategic battlefield for IP insertion. Companies race to get their specific proprietary technologies adopted as the standard. Once a technology is declared a standard essential patent, it triggers a legal phenomenon known as lock-in. The moment the gavel bangs on the 5G specification, every manufacturer on Earth, from the mighty Apple to the smallest budget phone maker, is legally locked into using those specific patents. They are trapped in a monopoly by consensus. The market competition effectively ends before the first product is even manufactured. The patent holders no longer need to compete on price or innovation. They simply need to enforce compliance. And the most aggressive practitioner of this doctrine is Qualcomm. They operate on a business model that legal scholars describe as vertical leverage. Qualcomm is unique because they hold the critical patents for CDMA and LTE technologies, but they also manufacture the modem chips, the physical silicon that reside in your phone. This allows them to execute a strategy known as supply chain interdiction. Historically, Qualcomm enforced a policy famously known in the industry as no license, no chips. The leverage is absolute. If a smartphone manufacturer refused to pay the patent royalties, Qualcomm would simply cut off the supply of physical processors. This is asymmetric warfare. For a company like Apple, losing access to modem chips means ceasing production of the iPhone immediately. It is an existential threat that overrides any negotiation tactic. The core conflict, and the reason Apple cannot win this war, lies in the royalty-based calculation. Apple argues for component-level licensing. They believe they should pay royalties based on the value of the modem chip itself, which costs approximately $20 to $40. Qualcomm, however, enforces device-level licensing. They charge a percentage of the final sale price of the entire device. This means that when Apple increases the storage, improves the camera system, or uses a premium titanium casing, innovations that have absolutely nothing to do with cellular connectivity, Qualcomm's royalty check gets bigger. Apple calls this extortion. Qualcomm calls it the price of connectivity. And the courts are often paralyzed by the complexity of FRAND terms: fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. In this ecosystem, Apple is not the master of its destiny. It is a vassal state paying tribute to the lords of infrastructure. They have the cash, but they do not have the foundational IP. And as we will see, having the best product means nothing if you don't own the invisible roads it travels on. In the chaotic landscape of standard essential patents, there exists a theoretical safeguard known as FRAND, an acronym for fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. When a company like Qualcomm or Nokia contributes their technology to a global standard like 5G, they are legally obligated to license that technology to everyone, even their competitors, on FRAND terms. On paper, this sounds like a democratization of technology, a promise that the infrastructure of the future will be accessible to all manufacturers at a fair price. However, in the courtroom, FRAND is not a shield. It is a weapon of ambiguity. The central failure of the system lies in the definition of reasonable. There is no objective algorithm to determine the value of a specific patent within a device as complex as a smartphone. Does the value of a 4G antenna derive from the cost of the silicon, or does it derive from the utility of the entire device? This interpretative gap creates a litigation void, where companies like Apple and Qualcomm engaged in a multi-jurisdictional legal war that spanned 3 continents. In January 2017, Apple initiated what industry analysts called the thermonuclear legal war. They sued Qualcomm for $1 billion, accusing the chipmaker of abusing its monopoly power and charging exorbitant royalties that had no connection to the value of the patents. Apple ceased paying royalties to its contract manufacturers, effectively cutting off Qualcomm's revenue stream from the iPhone. This was a calculated risk, a direct challenge to the no-license, no-chips doctrine. Apple's legal argument rested on the concept of patent exhaustion, asserting that once Qualcomm sold the chip, its patent rights were exhausted, and it could not double-dip by charging a licensing fee on the final device. But Qualcomm's counter-strategy was ruthless and surgically precise. They did not just argue about money. They deployed the nuclear option of patent law, injunctive relief. Injunctive relief is a court order that stops an infringing activity. In the context of smartphones, it means a sales ban. Qualcomm knew that fighting in U.S. courts would take years, so they engaged in forum shopping. They filed lawsuits in jurisdictions known for being friendly to patent holders and swift in their rulings, specifically Germany and China. The strategy was to weaponize the legal systems of key markets to choke Apple's supply chain. In December 2018, the strategy yielded a catastrophic result for Apple. A court in Munich granted Qualcomm an injunction, banning the sale of older iPhone models in Germany. Weeks later, a court in Fuzhou, China, issued a similar preliminary injunction. The message was clear: Qualcomm was willing to burn down Apple's global sales network to enforce its royalty model. This created a scenario of asymmetric risk. For Qualcomm, a loss in court meant a reduction in royalty rates, a financial blow but survivable. For Apple, a loss meant the inability to sell its core product in the world's largest markets. The pressure was compounded by the imminent transition to 5G. Apple's only other modem supplier, Intel, was struggling to produce a competitive 5G chip. Apple was facing a, quote, technological dead end. If they continued the war, they would miss the 5G cycle, a delay that would destroy their market share for years. The convergence of legal defeats in Germany and China, combined with the strategic necessity of 5G components, forced a capitulation. On April 16, 2019, just as opening arguments were beginning in a San Diego federal court, Apple and Qualcomm announced a surprise settlement. The terms were a total victory for the patent holder. Apple agreed to pay an undisclosed sum, estimated to be at least $4.5 billion, and entered into a 6-year licensing agreement. This settlement validated the device-level licensing model. It proved that in the architecture of modern telecommunications, possessing the foundational IP grants leverage that even a $2 trillion company cannot overcome. The FRAND obligation, which was designed to prevent holdup, had failed to protect a licensee. Instead, the legal system affirmed that the incentive to innovate, protected by the threat of injunctions, supersedes the economic burden on the manufacturer. Apple retreated, realizing that they could win the argument on fairness, but they would lose the war on physics and logistics. As the dust settled on the billion-dollar settlement between Apple and Qualcomm, a haunting question emerged in the tech industry. Why Apple? Why is the most valuable company in history the primary victim of this royalty extraction regime, while competitors like Samsung, Huawei, and Ericsson seem to navigate these waters with relative immunity? The answer lies in a cruel irony of intellectual property strategy known as defensive portfolio asymmetry. You see, Samsung is not just a phone manufacturer. They are a telecommunications infrastructure giant. They hold thousands of standard essential patents, BEP, for 5G towers and transmission protocols. When Qualcomm demands royalties from Samsung, Samsung can simply slide a folder across the table containing their own patents that Qualcomm infringes upon. This creates a stalemate, a state of mutually assured destruction. They engage in cross-licensing, effectively canceling out each other's debts. It is a Cold War negotiation. If you sue me, I will burn your network down. Apple, however, has no such leverage. Apple is a consumer electronics company, not a network infrastructure provider. They have designed the world's most advanced mobile processor, the A-series Bionic chip, and they have built the most lucrative software ecosystem, the App Store. But in the realm of cellular connectivity, the invisible waves that actually make a phone, Apple is structurally naked. They have zero counter-leverage. They cannot threaten Qualcomm, Nokia, or Ericsson because they own nothing that these giants need. This forces Apple into the position of a, quote, perpetual tenant. They are living in a digital skyscraper built by their rivals, paying exorbitant rent that increases every time they renovate their own apartment. This is the sovereign paradox. Apple has absolute control over its silicon, its software, and its supply chain, but it has zero sovereignty over the airwaves. This vulnerability drove Apple to attempt the ultimate escape plan: vertical integration of the modem. In 2019, Apple acquired Intel's smartphone modem business for $1 billion. The goal was to build their own 5G chip, eliminating the need to buy physical components from Qualcomm. But here lies the tragic reality, the sadness of Apple's position. Even if Apple succeeds in engineering a perfect 5G modem, a feat that has proven incredibly difficult, they will still have to pay Qualcomm. Why? Because the royalties are not for the chip, they are for the patents. You can print your own book, but you still owe royalties to the person who invented the alphabet. This is the hardware fallacy. Building the hardware does not exempt you from the intellectual property tax of the standard. Furthermore, look at the Chinese giants like Huawei. Why do they survive? Because they are effectively state-backed patent fortresses. Huawei owns the largest portfolio of 5G patents in the world. They are the ones setting the toll booths, not just paying them. Apple, in contrast, is an American icon that ironically finds itself isolated by the very global standard system the West created. They are the cash cow for the entire industry. Every time you buy an iPhone, you are subsidizing the R&D departments of Apple's enemies. So we end this trilogy not with a victory, but with a realization of the golden cage. Apple will continue to make the world's most profitable devices. They will continue to innovate in AI, cameras, and materials. But they will never be truly free. In the geopolitical architecture of technology, there are landlords and there are tenants. And despite having $3 trillion in the bank, Apple remains the world's richest tenant. The iPhone is a masterpiece of engineering, yes, but it is a masterpiece painted on a canvas owned by someone else. And as long as we rely on global standards like 5G and 6G, the patent oligarchy will always collect its tithe. The war is over, and the status quo has won.